In 1976, you could fly from London to New York in 3.5 hours. The ticket cost roughly $12,000 in today's money. You would arrive before you left, crossing time zones so fast that your watch went backwards. And for the duration of the flight, you would be dining on lobster, drinking vintage Krug, and cruising at twice the speed of sound at 60,000 feet, high enough to see the curvature of the Earth beneath you. The pilots wore the same uniform as their subsonic counterparts. The passengers dressed as if attending a formal dinner. The combination said almost everything about what Concorde was. This was the Concorde cabin, and nothing before or since has matched it. The first thing that surprised every first-time Concorde passenger was how small the cabin was. The aircraft had a maximum cruising altitude of 60,000 feet and a fuselage diameter of just under 9 feet. That is narrower than a typical wide-body jet of the era. The cabin held between 92 and 100 passengers depending on configuration, arranged in 2-and-2 seating across a single aisle. The ceiling was low enough that taller passengers instinctively ducked when boarding. The windows were famously tiny, roughly the size of a paperback book, because the engineers had to manage the stress loads on the fuselage skin that heated to over 100 degrees Celsius at Mach 2. Each window was a complex multi-layer laminated assembly designed to withstand the thermal cycling of repeated supersonic flights, and the seals were replaced more frequently than almost any other component on the aircraft. The fuselage itself actually expanded by as much as 12 inches during flight due to aerodynamic heating, a phenomenon that the flight engineers monitored continuously. When passengers touched the cabin walls mid-flight, they were warm to the touch. The Concorde was, in effect, a flying pressure vessel operating at the outer edge of commercial aviation. Passengers paid for the experience of being inside it, not the spaciousness of it. The seating on Concorde was narrower than most transatlantic first-class cabins of the same era. The seats were arranged 2 on each side of a central aisle, with a pitch of roughly 38 inches, generous by economy standards, but modest compared to the lie-flat beds that long-haul business class would later introduce. British Airways operated in a single cabin class, which they branded simply as Concorde class. Air France did the same. There was no economy section, no business section, and no tiered service. Every passenger got the same treatment, which meant the service levels were calibrated to the expectations of people paying the equivalent of a business class transatlantic return just for the seat. The seats were upholstered in soft pale leather. British Airways eventually introduced a revised seat design in the 1990s with improved lumbar support, responding to feedback from frequent passengers who were making the crossing multiple times per month and treating the aircraft almost as a commuter service. The fold-down tray table was exactly that. The overhead lockers were small. None of this seemed to matter to regulars, many of whom had memorized which rows had the best views out of those small oval windows and which side of the aircraft faced the sun on westbound morning departures. The galley service on Concorde was one of the most elaborate in commercial aviation history, which makes it all the more remarkable given the constraints of the aircraft. British Airways employed a dedicated Concorde catering team that worked with suppliers including Mosimans in London and later developed menus in partnership with Michelin-starred chefs. Passengers departing Heathrow in the morning would be served a full breakfast starting with freshly squeezed orange juice, smoked salmon blinis, and a choice of hot entrees. On afternoon and evening services, the menu might begin with beluga caviar, served with blinis and creme fraiche, followed by a main course of beef Wellington or lobster thermidor. Desserts were designed to be assembled and plated in the miniature galley by attendants who had trained specifically for the aircraft. The champagne service ran continuously. Krug Grande Cuvée was the standard pour on British Airways Concorde flights for much of the aircraft's operational life. Dom Pérignon appeared on seasonal menus. French Burgundy and Bordeaux were served with the main course, chosen to complement whatever the chef had paired that season. The flight attendants were among the most experienced in the airline. Crews bid specifically for Concorde routes, and the assignment was considered prestigious. The ratio of crew to passenger was exceptional. On a 92-seat British Airways Concorde, there were typically 6 cabin crew, giving a ratio that matched the service levels of private aviation. The flight lasted 3.5 hours from London to New York. In that time, attendants served a full multi-course meal, cleared between each course, maintained the champagne flow, and prepared the cabin for landing, all while the aircraft was accelerating through the sound barrier. Concorde attracted a specific and unusual passenger mix that evolved over its 27 years of commercial service. In the early years, the passengers were primarily corporate executives and diplomats for whom time was literally money. An investment banker who needed to be in New York for a morning board meeting and back in London for dinner could accomplish that in a single day on Concorde. The airline specifically marketed this to firms in the City of London and Wall Street. Then came the celebrities. The list of regular Concorde passengers reads like a who's who of the late 20th century. Elizabeth Taylor flew it repeatedly. Mick Jagger was a regular. Joan Collins, who lived between London and Los Angeles, used Concorde as her default transatlantic option when connecting through New York. Paul McCartney, David Bowie, and Elton John all flew it regularly. Phil Collins famously used Concorde to perform at both the London and Philadelphia Live Aid concerts on the same day in July 1985, flying across the Atlantic between sets. The aircraft became the de facto transport of the wealthy and famous in a way that no commercial aircraft before or since has matched. This was partly because it was genuinely exclusive. There were only 14 Concordes in commercial service between British Airways and Air France. Regular Concorde flyers often knew each other. The aircraft's small cabin created an unusual social dynamic in which the passenger in 2A might recognize the passenger in 3A from a previous flight. And by the third hour of the journey, a conversation had started over champagne that would have been unthinkable in a larger aircraft. What the passengers actually experienced during the flight was unlike anything in commercial aviation. Concorde took off from Heathrow on Afterburner, which produced a roar that the surrounding communities had been complaining about since 1976. Passengers felt the raw acceleration as the aircraft climbed steeply. At around 25,000 feet, the captain would typically announce that the aircraft was approaching the speed of sound. A Mach meter was mounted at the front of the cabin, and passengers watched it tick up through Mach 1.0. There was no dramatic moment, no bang, no shudder. The aircraft simply accelerated through the sound barrier and continued climbing. By the time it reached cruise altitude of 60,000 feet, the Mach meter read 2.02, twice the speed of sound, approximately 1,300 miles per hour. At that altitude, the sky above was a deep, almost navy blue, even in daytime. The sun appeared brighter and harder. Passengers seated on the right side of a westbound departure could often see, through those small windows, the distinct curvature of the Earth on the horizon, a sight ordinarily reserved for astronauts. The descent from cruise altitude was equally distinctive. Concorde slowed through the sound barrier over the Atlantic, typically west of Ireland on eastbound flights, and passengers felt the aircraft settle gently as the engines reduced thrust. The rate of deceleration was perceptible. Inside, the cabin was cool, pressurized, and extraordinarily quiet. Concorde at cruise was notably quieter inside than many subsonic jets, partly because there was no engine sound bleeding through the rear of the aircraft. Concorde was never profitable in any conventional sense. The development cost was shared between the British and French governments under a treaty signed in 1962, and by the time the aircraft entered commercial service in 1976, those costs had ballooned to an estimated £1 billion, an extraordinary sum for the era. The operating economics were challenging from the start. The fuel burn was roughly 4 times that of a comparable subsonic aircraft per seat. The small cabin limited revenue per departure. Maintenance was expensive and highly specialized. British Airways and Air France had purchased their Concordes from the British and French governments at a nominal price, essentially a government subsidy that allowed both airlines to operate profitably at the route level, while the capital cost was absorbed by taxpayers. During the late 1980s and 1990s, Concorde was genuinely profitable for both airlines on a cash basis, with the London to New York route generating revenues that subsidized other parts of their networks. But the underlying economics depended on passengers paying premium fares that were sustainable only as long as Concorde maintained its mystique and its monopoly on transatlantic supersonic travel. When Air France retired its fleet in June 2003, following the catastrophic crash of Flight 4590 in July 2000, and British Airways followed in October of the same year, no private operator stepped forward to continue the service. The aircraft was simply too expensive to maintain and too specialized to hand off. The last commercial Concorde flight landed at Heathrow on October the 24th, 2003. Passengers who were on board had paid significant premiums to be there. Many wept. Several of the crew had spent entire careers on the aircraft. The Concorde cabin was a specific product of its era, expensive, narrow, technically demanding, and unlike anything else in aviation. 20 years later, several companies are attempting to revive supersonic passenger travel. None of them has produced an aircraft that flies commercially. The physics of supersonic flight have not changed. Neither has the fuel cost, the sonic boom problem, or the economic challenge of filling a small cabin at premium fares. The Concorde worked because of a combination of timing, government subsidy, and the particular social dynamics of the 1970s through the early 2000s. It was, above all else, an experience. And the experience was irreplaceable.